The RBI has to put it in the priority list, so that will help in the retail lending also, and also the corporate lending. Amitabh Khan, Nitin Gadkari, all these people have very good intent, but it has to be, they have to work closely with PMO, with the Finance Ministry, Nirmala Sitaraman. From a manufacturer's perspective, I would say that, you have a good balance of debt and equity, not look at just getting it financed by equity. And for debt, I think strong intervention by the Finance Ministry and RBI to make it priority sector, provide some good subvention in the interest rate, so that it lowers the cost of the project ultimately. One of my friends was telling me, who worked very closely with Elon Musk over there for this Tesla. So he considered this as a totally different, not an automobile product at all.
Welcome, sir, on the Climapreneur show. I'm extremely honored and delighted to have you here with us today.
Thank you so much. I'm also really delighted to be here on this show.
Thank you.
EV is a very passionate subject for me.
What makes you passionate about EV? Tell me.
So I've been associated with the EV ecosystem for the last 10 years. 10 years back when I joined Mahindra & Mahindra, that was the time, we acquired, the Reva brand and the Reva company in Bangalore from Maini's. It was a joint venture, and then it went on to become a fully owned company. Until about a few months back, until I was associated with the Mahindra Group, I was very closely and passionately involved with the EV project and with the EV company. And now in my second innings, as a startup mentor, I'm involved with a number of EV startups, both in the four-wheeler space and the two-wheeler space. So having been associated for almost a decade on both the manufacturing and distribution and financing side. That makes me very passionate about the whole thing. And I think there's still a lot of scope for the EV players, and that's how I'm kind of mentoring a number of startups in this particular area.
No, definitely, there's a scope, and we'll be addressing some of the challenges that startup face and how can they really overcome that. So, to start with, this is one of the statements by Amitabh Khan, the CEO of Niti Aayog, where he mentions that financial institutions have an important role to play in accelerating the adoption of EVs in India and transport and supporting the decarbonization of road transport. So, I want to ask you that what, according to you, is the role of strong financial institutions and ecosystem in supporting India's EV ecosystem, and as a nation, where are we today in building that ecosystem?
Yeah, of course, the government of India has done a number of things to kind of support this EV growth, and we have seen this over the last one decade. But so far, the financial institutions have not really come to the party, as much as we would like from an industry perspective. So the entire thing is either funded by the players themselves, the industry players, because so far the bigger players have been there who have, good kind of cash flow. So they funded it largely through their internal accruals. But I would say going forward, especially, when new players come or, startups come, I think the financial institutions have to kind of adopt a little bit of liberal approach and kind of, treat this as a priority sector. And for that, maybe the government also has to enact certain laws, RBI, that this is a priority sector. Just like there's so many priority sectors. EV definitely is a priority sector. And let me tell you, the profitability, at least in the initial period, may not be that great. And because of which it requires some kind of subvention also. As you know, the interest rates have started rising once again because of the high inflation scenario. And in this kind of a scenario, if one really looks at the traditional credit risk, this would be a very high risk kind of a scenario, which would mean high interest rate. And the EVs, the manufacturing plants or the distributors, they just cannot afford that. So it has to be done with a subvention, which would come, if you classify as a priority sector. Maybe even a more kind of a subvention coming from some specialized schemes, which government has been giving, various incentives. But I think on the financing side, that those incentives have to be given, one from the manufacturing perspective and another from the consumer perspective also. Because as we know, the cost of the batteries is very high.
Yes,
And
yes.
because of that, the overall cost of the electric vehicle is still very high. Even if you consider all the savings due to the savings in the fuel cost, still the TCO especially at the personal level, the cost of operations for personal user is still not very viable. So the government is doing various kind of tax incentives, for example, for housing sector, where that initial euphoria is over, and right now various people are using just for their own tax planning, but really one really doubts whether that kind of incentive is required. But definitely in the case of EV, and incentivization in my view is definitely should be there, where a person, if they buy a EV, just like you have an interest deduction for home loans, for a EV loan, if there's interest deduction from the income, then it will go a long way for individuals to go for a loan for firstly to purchase a EV vehicle, and then go for a loan, and on which they would get interest deduction, which of course would be a very big incentive. So those kind of incentives are definitely required to push the EV system, particularly in personal vehicles, and similarly for commercial vehicles as well, whether it's for 3-wheelers or 4-wheelers. Ultimately they have to make sure that all this talk about green is very good, but ultimately it should be viable. It should be viable both for the manufacturer and most importantly for the consumer. Because if it is not viable for the consumer, they will not buy it. And we have seen it over the last 1 decade. Despite of various things which have been done, the consumer demand has not been to the extent like what we forecasted or what we thought will happen, and that is largely because of the price of the EV is substantially higher than the traditional IC engine.
This is something like recently I was in talks like with one of my family members. So like he wanted to buy a new car and we were just discussing. I told him that why not to buy an EV, and he like gave me a chart that he had drawn out like after researching, where he mentioned that it's very expensive. Like he compared it to the normal vehicle and number of kilometers that he will be driving. So he said that EV is not financially feasible for me. You might want to purchase it because you come from this background, or you are very strongly focused towards sustainability, environment and everything, but for me it's not feasible. And he literally gave me a full chart drawn out that this makes EV very expensive for me.
Yeah,
And now what we are
absolutely.
seeing, I feel that like, and at that point of time I really didn't have an answer to to the kind of stats he has drawn out, because to be honest the stats were correct.
Yeah, absolutely. The
And
stats
I
were
also
correct.
want, I
Mhm.
also want to ask you, sir, here that is the depreciation rate of EV less than the depreciation rate of a normal vehicle? Because that also forms an important point for consumer to uptake and to adopt an EV vehicle, basically.
No, depreciation rate is not lower, but
Hmm.
depreciation rate largely would impact the corporates. So corporate demand is one thing, but
Hmm.
just like for IC engine and any popular car, the demand is driven by the consumer, and in the
Hmm.
consumer, large portion of the Indian consumer is the middle class, and they are
Yes.
very conscious about their monthly budget.
Hmm.
And if you have a high cost of the EV and the EMIs are high, so either you give an interest rate, some kind of a subvention, or like a priority sector, but there also it has a limitation. But
Yeah.
what if and that is what happened about couple of decades back,
Hmm.
when the housing demand, in spite of all the efforts from HDFC
Hmm.
and from the government, was still not picking up. And then one of the finance minister, I don't know who, maybe Manmohan Singh, they decided to come up with a scheme of special rate of deduction for interest paid on housing loans.
Hmm.
And that, I remember, that is the time I also went for a housing loan. Otherwise, I said, such a high interest rate, it is better to construct my own house from my own funds, which of course has its own limitations.
Hmm.
But the moment this particular scheme came, your cost of the loan came down significantly down because of the tax benefit.
Hmm.
And that really spurred the housing boom in the country over the last 2 decades. It won't be a kind of exaggeration to say that it was driven by these government incentives like the interest, this income tax exemption on the housing loan. So similarly for EV loans, there has to be some kind of a exemption which would drive the middle class to kind of manage their monthly budget in a way that EV becomes affordable to them.
No, I definitely agree on this. And even the report that was released by Niti Aayog and the Rocky Mountain Institute, and that actually said that, the importance of priority sector recognition for retail lending in the electric mobility ecosystem. And the
Yeah.
report also sort of, provided the considerations and recommendations to inform the inclusion of EV in the Reserve Bank of India's priority lending
The
sector.
priority list. That's what I
Yeah.
was saying. The RBI has to put it in the priority list. So that will help in the retail lending also, and also
Yes.
the corporate lending. So suppose if somebody is putting up a EV project and if he has to pay the commercial rate of interest where his project is assessed as high risk, whether it's for a working capital loan or a project loan, it would be substantially higher. And there again I would like to mention that today these startups, because the interest rate is prohibitively higher, they are looking for equity funding.
Yeah.
Now, the equity funding, it's they find it just because the interest rates are higher on the loan. But the cost of equity is not free, but they are willing to get diluted because there's no other option.
There's no way.
And at that initial period, nobody will offer a good valuation, and the dilution will be so high that ultimately they'll be left with very little stake and very little skin in the game, and because of which the interest again will dwindle. So the whole thing will become a non-starter. So that they are swayed away from equity and into a debt, because the cost of the project still is very high. So you have to kind of have a good balance between debt and equity. You cannot just think of funding it by equity, because you will not get a premium in the beginning, and kind of if you dilute and put that much of equity, firstly that much of equity is not available in the market, and that's why a lot of these startups, as I said, I'm very closely associated with these startups, and they are just struggling to kind of get off the get off the board, from the drawing board to the actual execution, because of the lack of funding. So there again, a good priority sector kind of approach will provide them access to debt at a concessional rate, and based on that, then they will get some equity funding also, which they can balance out and not have too much of dilution, and the project can take off. And of course, ultimately, as I said, after the project takes off, the EV comes on the road, it has to be backed by a strong retail lending and of course infrastructure. So right now it is more of finances, but the infrastructure also has to be funded well, means particularly the charging. The charging stations, a lot of people are coming into it, but at times, at the times of the high interest rate, if government again doesn't consider that as a priority sector, then those expansion of the charging infrastructure will suffer, and that will not be again good for the overall EV ecosystem. So one is the project side, then the charging infrastructure, and then the retail side, where the ultimate cost to the consumer should be within his kind of overall budget constraints. We cannot, very few families in India will not have a budget constraint. Those are all HNIs. And if your electric vehicles are just catering to the HNIs, it's not going to take off, because the volumes will will not be there, And the HNIs may just go for imported cars, or some of these, those luxury players are now coming with electric vehicles. This Mercedes and BMW and all, so they will go for those vehicles, but that will not help the overall EV ecosystem. So those are the, I think, the considerations which I think the government has to very seriously address, because otherwise, just by a talk of about the carbon neutrality, going green, without the financial viability being addressed, it will not take the EV ecosystem forward.
Like these were the challenges which I also read in the last year's report, which actually mentioned, like electric two-wheelers for the final mile delivery, where they said, while demonstrating the business model viability is a challenge for fleet operators, many
Mm-hmm.
find it difficult to access the equity or debt to purchase vehicles that they lease to drivers for deliveries. That
Yeah,
was
yeah.
two-wheelers. Then coming to three-wheelers for, for immediate public transport, which also said that due to higher capital costs, these drivers require financing to purchase the
Yeah.
e-rickshaws or e-autos, and they lack a credit history again to prove that they can actually repay the loan, and in that
Yes.
case they don't even have a collateral, so that again limits that. And in the electric buses, for example, the debt finance requirements and fees make it difficult for operators to purchase the e-buses fleet.
Yes. Yes.
Typically the
Yes.
operations are required to finance, like operators are required to finance about 25% of the total capital cost as equity, representing a significant down payment for a fleet of e-buses.
Yes, exactly. I mean, those are the issues and which would require a very innovative approach. And
What do
one
you
of
think
the
could be the innovative approach? Like, for example, what if you were in that situation to create something? What would you create? Like, what like solution or what approach would you use?
yeah, one is of course from a manufacturer's perspective.
Hmm.
I would say that you have a good balance of debt and equity, not to look at just getting it financed by equity. And for
Hmm.
debt, I think strong intervention by the finance ministry and RBI to make
Hmm.
it priority sector, provide some good subvention in the interest rate
Hmm.
so that it lowers the cost of the project ultimately. I mean, and becomes affordable. The all those parameters like the debt service coverage and all. If interest rates are too high, you will not be able to service the debt. So,
Yes.
so that will go a long way. And then, of course, ultimately is the numbers. See, once you put the vehicle on the road and the numbers just don't come, your project is installed for all practical purposes. In fact, it goes into unviable territory.
Hmm.
And so that absolutely, I mean, I have thought about it over the years. And to me, one of the solutions, at least I have in my mind, is this income tax benefit to the EV, to the people who go in for EV loan. And that is the kind of thing which, can make it affordable for them and prompt them to buy. I mean, in India, people are very much driven by these income tax exemptions and all. When there was a housing, this thing, crisis, government went for this housing loan interest exemption. Then, all these various savings, those government wanted the saving rate to be increased substantially. Then that's the time this exemptions came in a big way. Earlier, I remember the exemptions were not there, and then exemptions came in a big way in terms of PPF. So all these public savings, LIC I think was there, but non-LIC related exemptions were not there. And so people were just going for LIC. Even people knew that it is offering no return. Just because you're getting tax exemption, your mind is like immediately like, okay, it's giving me tax exemption, let me go for it. So I can tell you, I mean, the demand will increase substantially. And you need to just kickstart. See, once, just like a typical automobile, and particularly in the earlier carburetor-based engine, you have to just kickstart the thing. And once it kind of kickstarts, then, I mean, it kind of just goes on its own momentum. So once you get the volumes, in spite of all the other handicaps, the volumes come in, I can tell you the whole ecosystem will just kickstart, including the charging infrastructure. Because there also it is a chicken and egg situation, because they are not vehicles, they are not putting the charging stations. And because there are no charging stations, people are not buying vehicle. And suppose even if I want to buy a vehicle, I mean, I'm not living in an apartment, I'm in a gated community. And I don't want to put a charging station in my house because of, again, all the safety related risk. But there's no kind of a place where you can get the vehicle charged. And even apartment kind of people, they are very reluctant to provide charging infrastructure. So you have to have a very strong kind of this thing where maybe at the petrol pumps or some kind of designated places you have charging infrastructure. But that also has its own cost of real estate, cost of the technology itself, cost of the equipment. So all that will come, and if people see the volumes, the number of vehicles flying around, I mean, that's what has happened in Europe. The volumes were very high, particularly in North Europe. The volumes were so high that, all these things happened almost immediately,
Yes.
I mean, one after the other. It supported, it was like a typical the domino effect you have, where, one thing kind of leads to the other and just snowballs into and you see some of these countries in North Europe, they have more than 50% of the vehicles already in the EV category, Norway and others. Just because, there was so much of government incentive over there, and government direct subsidy, I don't really see a government providing too much of direct subsidy to the consumers. Government is providing through this FAME 1, FAME 2, and that has its own limitation. We have seen, that is not enough, to because as I said, interest rates are still high, people are looking for financing, and ultimately then people start comparing with the IC engine. And the moment you start comparing with the IC engine, at least at this stage, in spite of the fuel cost being high, people still think that, okay, it is better and safer to go for IC engine. And then at the point of purchase, then the EV kind of a thing goes for a toss. But the moment you see some extra incentive, the moment you see, okay, this is so let's go, on the IC engine you have, for example, no income tax deduction. Here you have income tax deduction. So let's go for it. Similarly, priority sector, there's no priority sector status for IC engine. So you have to do certain things for the EV category which just don't exist in the IC kind of I know Amitabh Khan, Nitin Gadkari, all these people have very good intent, but it has to be, they have to work closely with PMO, with the Finance Ministry, Nirmala Sitharaman, at least for the immediate. Once the whole thing kicks off, then I think the kind of GST you will get on the, the incremental sales and all will more than compensate for any loss which the government may have on either interest subvention or on income tax or any such thing. So those are just temporary. Ultimately, the long-term benefits will be much higher. And that is what I would strongly urge the government. The players also, as I said, as you said, so suppose if I'm an EV player and most of the startups, I advise them that don't fall into the trap of equity, But they also have, when we look at the numbers, they say at times, debt is difficult to service. I say you work out the economics in a way that you service the debt, don't shy of debt, and go for a kind of a all equity option, because then you will demand a good valuation, which PE investor or VC investor will give you good value, because your project may not take off, and if they give you a good premium in the beginning, they also don't get, because they are taking a high risk, they would want a high return. So initial valuation, they would want a lower valuation so that at least they can exit in the medium term, even if the project has a kind of a lukewarm kind of a takeoff. So, those chicken and egg situation, I see it every day, especially with the kind of startups which I am working with. And so the solution is, somebody has to take the bull by the horn, as they say, and resist the temptation, which is very important,
You mentioned it quite rightly, and quite recently I interviewed someone who was working on the two-wheeler space in the EV sector, and they said that their EV startup is self-funded. And I was surprised, that because I haven't heard of an EV startup that was self-funded, and they were very clear, we want to reach a particular threshold and uske baad we want to raise funds.
Yeah, because they find the debt servicing very difficult, because the volume uncertainty is there. So so the large players can do that. See the Mahindra Group, Tata Group, Hyundai, Maruti. When they say that, they are laying out so much of funds for the EV sector, they have the internal generation and the deep pockets to kind of, make sure that what you said is self-funded. Even like the Ola has put up a EV setup. So, because they have such a great valuation for the main business, which is Ola itself, and to kind of leveraging on those valuation, they can almost self-fund. But for something to be viable in its own without any dependence on the parent, then the self-funding cannot be an answer to start with.
And also, I want to ask from you that, many startups who are starting from different states, for example, I know of a startup who is particularly working now in Delhi and looking to, expand pan-India. Someone starting from Bangalore looking to expand pan-India. What would be your advice to these startups when they're looking to expand pan-India? What, sort of finances should they be careful about? And, how can they really go about expanding pan-India from one state?
Yeah, so fortunately now we have this GST. So that kind of those barriers between the states are broken, and you have a single GST. So that helps in a pan India expansion. But definitely, I mean, one is of course the dealership, because see, in automobile, unlike in several other products, including some white goods also these days, we are saying that I mean, it's going for online sales. But in automobile, people want the touch and feel. You have to have the servicing. So you have to have a network of dealership. You cannot, kind of survive without a network of dealership.
Yeah.
And the dealerships, they are looking to go pan India, which I think most of them will. The way the volumes will not come, is focus on the cities. Do some kind of a research, primary research, as to what all cities are the ones where the EV offtake will be there. So one is obvious is the metros, but some of the answers are not very obvious and it will surprise you. For example, Mumbai doesn't have a very strong EV offtake because of the traffic condition, because of there's so many apartments, and people are people are aware that the apartment owners are not very keen for the charging infrastructure, and overall because of that the mindset is. And for historical reason also you can partly say that, about that EV penetration is not high. But in a city like Bangalore, for example, the EV penetration is very good. To some extent, even in Pune it is good. Hyderabad it is good. NCR, of course, because of the state government incentive, the EV penetration is increasing very fast. So they have to do a lot of this primary research to see what all cities they should focus on, because they cannot just focus on the A-grade cities and then they'll soon find again that the volumes are not there. And at times some of these B-grade cities, the tier 2 cities, they may offer a good volume, particularly if those particular states are giving reasonable incentive to the customer in terms of exemption from road tax, some other benefits, and they can see some good. For example, Maharashtra government, in fact, we brought it out to the Maharashtra government that how come the states like Karnataka and Telangana is doing so well on EV while Maharashtra is not. So they came out with a very strong EV policy. And Mumbai also is now catching up compared to what it was earlier. But some of these smaller cities like Pune and Nasik and Nagpur, I mean, you see the EV kind of thing taking off. So that research is very important to kind of lay down your footprint on a pan India basis, because you cannot have because the volumes will not be there. Let's be candid about it. So you cannot have go into 50 cities, because the cost will be so much that again it will lead to non-viability. So instead of 50 cities, you have to focus on 20 cities. And when you have to cutting down from 50 cities to 20, you have to have a primary research which would say that these are the 20 most likely cities or the best cities for my product, for my vehicle.
Agreed. Also, what is one common mistake that you have seen EV startups make, and what would be your advice to them?
See, a common mistake again, and I would not name anyone, because people who have done deep research, they will know. But the thing is, at times people don't focus on the total cost of ownership, whether it's a personal consumer or a commercial consumer, and they want to sell it on the basis of that, okay, it's a green product. And now green product, people will like it, but when it comes to the real, that time of writing the check, means taking the decision of buying, that's the time when, they just lean towards the IC, because they think, as I said, everyone has to manage their monthly budget, and it just doesn't work in that, because the EMIs are being higher, you don't have any other incentive, and similarly for the commercial owner also, whether it's a 3-wheeler or a tempo or a 2-wheeler, and if you suddenly find that, I mean, I was better off in my IC engine or my IC kind of a auto rickshaw or a tempo, then why should I go for it? So if they focus on the total cost of ownership, whether it is for the personal customer or for a commercial customer, then the volumes will come, because then also you have to do work hard to convince them, but at least you have the numbers, and you have the statistics, and you have the backing, and then your salespeople just cannot do the normal pitching. Okay, it's a good vehicle, it's a green vehicle. You just buy it. It will not sell like that. You have to explain to them the economics. Typical help them get a financing. That is also very important. You cannot assume, because normal IC, you just go across to a good bank, ICICI Bank, HDFC Bank, the top, or a public sector bank also. They are very keen to finance any of the IC products, but they are not that keen to finance the electric vehicles. And plus, of course, the interest rates higher, and everything considered, is suddenly kind of, even if the person is genuinely interested, at times they don't find the financier. So if you have not done those kind of homework, and also taught your sales team to kind of go through that kind of a pain, selling an electric vehicle is a very different proposition than selling a IC vehicle. So those are the kind of lessons I have seen and I have learned, and that's what I advise my startups. And so that kind of a homework is very important, so that you can and make your assumptions very realistic.
Yes.
Straight away you think that you will be selling some 50,000 vehicles. I can tell you it will be a non-starter, and your product will come to it will fail to even take off. So assume a kind of a gradual ramp up. And as I said, make enough provision in your project cost about interest, and try and kind of get the backing of some known, either a player or some known VC, where a balanced approach is taken between debt, equity, various parameters. But most importantly, focus on the demand side. Very little work at times. People get so much kind of obsessed with I was looking for the right word, obsessed with the technology, that okay, I have the best technology, we are green, we have everything, this is least emission, this maximum power, maximum range, good speed, all this thing, without really looking at the demand side. They assume that with all these things, demand will automatically happen. It's not going to happen. So just like, you come up with a new product, it's virtually like a new product. You have a new product, it will not just sell, even if it is the best product. You have to educate the customer about what is so great about this product. Why should I buy this instead of buying some other product, So, and almost all the companies have done. Whenever there is a revolution which brings a new product, companies have gone ahead and educated the customer, worked hard on that, and that's where they have got the volumes. And the automobile players have to realize, and I think one of my friends was telling me, who worked very closely with Elon Musk over there for this Tesla. So he considered this as a totally different, not an automobile product at all, and not followed the typical automobile kind of strategy. Otherwise, Tesla won't have taken off the way it took off. He followed a completely that, okay, this is based on, of course, the parameters over there, a very non-conventional approach to produce and to sell his vehicles, and not compete with the big three at all. So, of course, some comparisons will be drawn with the IC, but you cannot just just follow that road and say, and try and compare and say, just because it is green, it is carbon neutral, okay, it is costing you a little bit more, but still, somehow you buy it, it will not happen.
And that's the reality, and we have to address the practical reality. And maybe I think Mahesh Babu also said the same thing.
Mahesh is a very good friend of mine. Incidentally, we worked very closely during our Mahindra days for the this electric project. So you were saying something. What did he say?
He also said the same thing. Like sometimes engineers forget the marketing side, and they are so down deep into technology that sometimes they forget to address, and that they have to address. So, having said that now, like, give me the name of, maybe 2 or 3 startups or companies which you feel that, EV startups can look upon. And these are like aspirational companies or aspirational startups that we can follow.
One aspirational one, of course, they are now dogged by some controversy also, because some of their vehicles had some technical flaws. is this Ola. Ola Electric is a very good kind of a startup example where, of course, Bhavesh, with all his understanding of a startup and how to start a venture, I think he's done well, and he is expected to do very well. And I think amongst the traditional players, of course, Tata and Mahindra are the two, which in the long run, okay, though Mahindra had initial hiccup, but I think in the long run, Tata and Mahindra would be the two strong players, because people who are coming with the expensive EVs, they will find initial kind of a traction amongst the, as I said, HNIs or people with a good wallet, but that is not sustainable in my view. And then there are kind of number of smaller ones, but as I said, one will have to just look at how they get fully funded before that takes off itself. And as I said, that's what the challenge we are grappling with. So maybe I'll be able to, some of them, if we get the financial closure over the next few months. We were looking to get the financial closure, but then now with the interest rate hikes and the funding crunch and all, so the people are struggling with the financial closure. In fact, Switch Mobility is another one where Mahesh Babu is there. That's also very promising. Ashok Leyland is, though it's a late starter, but they've done very well, and of course, Mahesh Babu being there is a very big thing itself. But apart from that, backing of the Leyland Group and overall, I think the strategy from whatever I've seen, they're also expected to do very well in Switch Mobility. And others, as I said, maybe 2-3 months if we achieve some closure, I may be able to give you a couple of more names.
Thank you so much for sharing all that with us, and thank you for being with us today. I just want to know one last thing from you, that what role or what can we as media platform do to be with the EV startups, to be with the EV ecosystem in this transition?
No, that's a very good question, and I would say that you people are already doing a great job in terms of the green revolution and all the other benefits, but you have to emphasize both to the entrepreneurs and to the government that it's not a very easy journey. It's in fact a very difficult journey.
Yes.
So people should not, at times people get swayed, EV, and then they draw on some example from Europe or from US, and and they think that they have hit upon, just because again they have the technology, they can just go and make it a success. Success and EV, at least for the next 5 years, would be very difficult to come by. To kind of, put that pessimistic note, but I think one has to exercise that kind of, you have to work very hard. And working hard, as I said, to make sure that the demand actually takes off, working hard on the marketing, on the financing side again, working with the government, and then, as the US media people, you are influencing the customer side quite a lot, which is very appreciable, the manufacturer and the overall automobile EV system, but put some kind of a financial sweetener also there, because it's a very difficult space. Yeah, and the real, the proof of the pudding will happen when, the EV volumes, for example, cross the 6-digit mark and all that. So that to happen, the government has to kind of take some bold steps. Yes. And those bold steps require a very bold approach, And, we have seen a lot of finance ministers take quite a number of bold steps over the last 30 years. And, they have kind of, it has become now folklore that, the kind of, the way these bold steps have helped the Indian economy. So similarly, I would say that if the government takes some more bold steps, and bold steps just doesn't mean doling out subsidy. I'm not for it at all. Just doling out, 2 lakh subsidy for one vehicle and all. That's not going to work. And what if once, because that will be temporary. Once it gets withdrawn, that's the end of it, and then again it will kind of crash down. So bold steps, with a little bit of imagination, with a little bit of, that kind of a work, and then it will pay off. The payoff will be significant, whether it is for the manufacturers or for the government. So that is where I think you as influencers, I mean, of course, I would say the first and the second stage, you people have done a great job. I think the next stage is just to kind of, let the government realize that, it's not a very easy space. It's not that, the IC players have worked less hard or some other reason has happened. I mean, the whole thing is that it is a difficult kind of a thing. And they have to kind of fully be in that journey so that they can ease the pain of the manufacturers, of the retailers, everyone, and ultimately of the consumer. And that's when you can see the real takeoff will happen, whatever, in 2025 or I'm still betting on 2025, but for that, as I said, it's not going to happen automatically. A lot will have to be done. And that's where Shweta, people like you, definitely will have to be a strong influencer. And not that you are not. I read your posts continuously on LinkedIn and other forums, but one has to kind of work with the likes of people who are strong influencers, Amitabh Kant, Nitin Gadkari, Piyush Goyal, Nirmala Sitharaman, and maybe PMO has to, because they are all such diverse ministries, maybe PMO has to kind of, bring the entire thing together in terms of some kind of a package for the customers.
That's what the intent of the entire conversation. Like, these conversations are not just to enable startups and to help them, but also to bring out these challenges which will come only when we talk to people like you, to startups who are facing issues, and maybe these challenges can serve as opportunities for government to work on. So, thank you for doing this, and thank you for doing the work you're doing, and please keep sharing all these with us, and
Yeah,
I hope
thanks.
that
Thank you,
together we can
Shweta.
do
Thank you so
something.
much for, allowing me to kind of, say a few things which at times, one is reluctant to say. And, but I hope you got the kind of inputs which you were looking from the talk.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you, Shweta.